Welcome, welcome, welcome to the second session for the afternoon. My name's Cather Simpson. I'm the convener for what's called TAES on your program, which always makes me think of, you know, electrically shocking somebody. But it stands for Technology, Applied Science, and Engineering. That's the domain that I convene. And one of my jobs as a domain convener and then as a member of the executive is to read the portfolios as they come through. I like to think of this as brain candy. It's very, very fun, and it gives me great pleasure always to come here and listen to people talk about what they've been doing. So today, we're going to hear several varied talks. We have a great span of talks. And just to get everybody so that the speakers also understand, Troll here is going to give a 5-minute warning at the halfway mark, a 1-minute warning when we're at 9 minutes, and then if they're still talking, 5 minutes later, I'll stand up and hit him over the head with the microphone. But hopefully we'll have time for questions. And just please, if you want to go to a different talk, we're going to try to keep to schedule because I know people like to pop back and forth. Just during that question time, hop up and go ahead and leave. And if you have a question, just ask it. We'll answer it. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Phil Lyver to tell us about what he's been doing.
Okay. Kia ora tātou. Tero kawana ki tāhuhu o takawhare. E whawhau hea, ki te kuranui, te kuroroa, ki ringa e te kauhau, heke kau mātua e heki iho, ko te pū, ko te weu, ko te more, ke te aoka, ko te reo, ko te wao nui, ko te kūne, te weu, te kore, te pō, ko ranganui e tu iho nei, ko papatua nuku e takotake nei. E puta au, te whēao, te ao marama, ti hei mōri ora. So, kia ora tātou, ko Phil Lyver ahau. The creation karakia that I just delivered there, the title of the presentation today sits within that. Te weo, it is a creation karakia, it is around sequences of time recognised by kaitiaki, and it's often put forward through the growth of a forest, starting from the origin, from the taproot, coming right through to the te ao wao nui, which is the forest itself in its full embellishment. But te weo are the fibrous roots that connect that forest to the whenua. And for the title of the story here, and for the people that I often work with, the communities that I work with, te weo is the kaitiaki. It's the roots that connect the kaitiaki to their whenua. And so I'd just like to acknowledge the communities that I've worked with actually over the last 25 years. There's been some fantastic people here, and in the photo here, you know, we've got Knights of the Realm, we've got Tā Pou Tēmara, Tūhoi Kaumātua, we've got New Zealander of the Year actually, Rangi Mātauranga. So, you know, and there's some fantastic tohunga kaumātua in these communities. And here, my own uncle, who's Rakiura, he's mutton birding down on the Rakiura Titi Islands. So just like to acknowledge them. One component when working with our communities, with our kaitiaki, is the way that they actually come to the species, to the landscape, to the whenua, to the moana, is the way they approach it. What are the key constructs and values that they approach it? This is what we're trying to build into kaitiakitanga, where kaitiakitanga is challenged by conservation. We have to try and start to recognise some of these key constructs, and we're talking things like simple things like mana. We're talking about whakawhanaungatanga, which is that interrelatedness. We're talking about ahikaroa, and that is connection to place, connection to people, connect to people here, connection to past generations, to tipuna, connections to future generations. So when we start to think about landscapes, or even with species, we have to think about this complexity, and that I suppose is what is representation in this diagram here, is the complexity of what we're talking about when we're referring to the environment. Just like in ecological food webs, you have direct and indirect relationships happening. Here it is the same thing. It's a mass force of those indirect relationships between those constructs, between mana, rangatiratanga, whakawhanaungatanga, manakitanga. Those things are all connected up. So when we start talking about key species for communities, that is what you're looking at. This is what we're looking at I mean, and this is what is not recognised, I don't think, so much in our current environmental and conservation systems. At the risk of being reductionist, but to try and start to understand some of the complexity, we can start to look at key species. This is a manu oi. This is a grey-faced petrel. It's a northern mutton bird that's harvested by multiple iwi in the North Island. We've got key components there, like wairua, mahenga kai, mana. What else have we got there? We've got the whakaheke kōrero, which is the knowledge transition. The knowledge is connected to the species. So all of these are connected up through that species here. But then what happens if you take that species away? And so this is what I believe our communities have been dealing with our conservation system, is that access to these species has been eroded. What happens, or can you replace these species? Can you replace it with another species? Can you still start to have that same complex of values and constructs if you have another species in place? Maybe yes, in some instances maybe not. So this is when we start to think about kaitiakitanga, about local support, decision-making support. That is some of the concepts we need to think about. And so what our communities are confronting is that if say the biodiversity is declining, and you have, just like in ecological systems, if they shift into an alternate space, into an alternate state by environmental drivers, are they then start to get impacted, I suppose, by other feedbacks, internal mechanisms, internal feedbacks. So, for example, with keraru in Te Urewera, so as species started to decline around, keraru started to decline around the country, the government put in place native bird prohibition harvests. And so tūhoe were blocked from actually harvesting those species. So of course, if you remove your interaction with those species, yes, you've got those declines, but then that legislation also starts to impact you. It becomes an internal mechanism of causing decline in those networks that I just spoke about, but also potentially the knowledge systems that go with that. So the more time you have out of contact with those species and interacting with those species, then you start to find potentially your knowledge systems around that start to erode. And so what we're looking to do then is start to alleviate that, and I think we heard that in Te Māori Tau's talk this afternoon, is that around rangatiratanga, is removing that and allowing that recovery of those knowledge states, of those value states as well, that go with those particular species. And the term we've used, like ecological hysteresis, is biocultural hysteresis. So we're dealing with not just ecological elements, we're dealing with cultural elements, economic elements. The ecological is in there, of course. So it's much more complex. And the value of actually keeping contact with a resource is hugely valuable. So we had a 15-year study with Rakiura Māori with harvesting titi, so sooty shearwaters, which is a burrowing seabird. Our whānau harvest chicks every year. In fact, they're down there now harvesting. Some keep diaries. And so that was a really phenomenal source of information that we were able to engage with over that time, and dating back into the 30s. So we had diaries, we had harvest tallies and times for harvest written on calendars, or even on the workshop walls. So they kept track of all of that, the changes in time, and so we're able to sort of track that the change in that resource, and they're able to look at that and see over that time. We're looking at a 2% decline over that period. One of the other fantastic components of it is linking it up with the science, is that we're able to link this with some of our quantitative methodologies. and look at how changes in harvest rates between years could be linked into some of the climate variations. And in this case, it was around the El Nino Southern Oscillation Index. And what we were able to find is harvests declined from one year to another. It actually predicted that 12 months out that an El Nino was coming, not just the state, but also the intensity of that event. And vice versa also, if the difference between those annual harvest rates, we found that it was a La Nina coming. So we're able to get insight from that mātauranga, and yes, it was a written form of mātauranga. I mean, mātauranga comes in a huge variety of forms. Some of it we can engage with as scientists, some we can't, and we obviously need to recognise stopping rules around that. But it provided us with a fantastic insight to why we were seeing those earlier declines. And we went further. We went back into the 30s and started to look at, this was the impact that some of these El Ninos were having. And so this is some machine learned outputs. That's why it's all so tight. But we could see that we were getting a sort of a 35% knockdown in our adult populations, and that was driving our populations down. And then we were looking at other elements like harvest, like weka, predation on the TT down there, and also bycatch in the Pacific. So all of these we were able to look at, and then start to provide advice back to the kaitiaki around their harvest, in terms of they can start talking about what's the opportunity that these harvests would remain sustainable out into the future. What's the percentage probability? And so that's the type of information we're working with kaitiaki. The photos you actually see here, this is Ngāti Awa, harvesters from the 40s and 50s, harvesting manu oi on Whale Island or off Bay of Plenty here. They put a rāhui, they recognised the decline. It was a rat-driven decline on the island. They put a rāhui in place. 50 years later, with our research and with the mātauranga, they were harvesting again. And so we're able to, obviously convince the minister to also lift a harvest prohibition. And just note, it's a rakiura. That's my uncle. He's rakiura. So there was a knowledge transfer going on as well, because some of the birders had been out of practice for so long. He was actually able to come up and actually demonstrate practice. Again, back to that whole network that was showed in the first slide. So I suppose that biocultural hysteresis is something, those feedbacks of what we're trying to break in terms of our work. And just to show, this is a Canadian example. We had 15 kaitiaki go to Canada into the Northwest Territories in September last year. We were harvesting caribou with the people. It was an on-the-land learning exercise. The federal government sent in their agents because they got a rumour that we were harvesting inside a caribou conservation zone. There is a prohibition zone that move with the caribou as they migrate. There's been quite a decline in that caribou population. They sent their agents in anyway to do a raid on our camp and check all our tents and take samples of meat to go back to try and demonstrate that we were harvesting inside the conservation. We couldn't quite put it all together. It ended up in court. The judge threw it out. He just said, this is ridiculous. This is, this is just an example, I suppose, of those ongoing feedback, that legislation, that press on Indigenous peoples around the world, and this is what they're having to deal with on an everyday basis. And that has an impact on that network that I showed you right at the beginning of, I suppose, isolating people from resource, and with that comes that loss. But we're trying to respond to this. This is I suppose, our emphasis. So, kia ora. We're starting to stand up.
We have time for questions. Does anyone have a question?
Fascinating. Richard Sorensen. What are your thoughts about how we can regenerate, so much of our land that should never have been cleared? I had a walk in the Wairarapa last year, and it's just a tragedy of the destruction of the forests there and all the landslips and very low productivity land. and the farming family wanted to start, replanting, but they said at the moment, if you put in natives, it just all get eaten by the deer, and then they thought you can only put in pine. I mean, those sorts of issues just seem quite extraordinary to me. Do you have any insight into how we can get going?
I suppose that is the million-dollar question. I mean, in terms of the for this, the context of this talk around, I suppose it is around having the Māori landowners, and Te Māori Tau again referred to this afternoon, is that they need to be able to regulate themselves, to be able to actually make decisions about their whenua. And it does actually include introduced species. I mean, that was a conversation we're having with Rangi Mātāmua in Te Urewera, is, what's our relationship look like with deer? If they're having this impact on our forests, should they be eradicated out of there? But, where they're a food supply now for us, so how do we actually start to relate to them? I suppose in terms of restoration, yes, that's what you need to get onto, is allowing those, allowing the opportunity for those species to regenerate on those lands. And removing ungulates is one of those, I suppose would be one of those priorities.
Well, as much as I hate to do it, I think any more questions for Dr. Lyver should be in the cocktail hour. Let's thank Dr. Lyver again for a fascinating talk.